Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night. Tonight we have Eric Hernandez, the Soul Man.
How you guys
Uh,
doing?
we're doing good. Bit crazy with the pandemic as always. How you and the kids been working out with this?
Been going good. A little bit crazy at the house, so it's not quite at all, but it's going good. We're staying in, keeping busy, working from home as much as we can, of course. But things are going good, thank God.
That's great. What
Tell
about
the dear
you?
audience about your background and what led you to do what you do.
Yeah. For those who aren't familiar, pretty much, the gist of the story is, so I grew up in church and whatnot, but my freshman year of college, I remember, was really pivotal for me, especially doing what I'm doing now. And it was Took my first class in philosophy my freshman year of college, just kind of as a blow off class, you know. And when I took that class, I remember before that, in one of my youth services, my youth pastor had said, if someone ever asks you to prove to them that God exists, you simply have to ask them to prove to me that He doesn't. And I thought, well, that's brilliant. You know, just I'll use that from now on. Um, and I remember my first week of philosophy class. I later came to find my professor was an atheist. So at the time, I didn't know he was an atheist. But he said, if anyone, excuse me, he said, what we're going to talk about this week is something called the burden of proof. And what the burden of proof is that if you make a claim that something's true, you bear the burden to prove the thing that you're claiming is true. So if he says, so if you make a claim to say something like, he said, as a random example, if you're a Christian and you claim that God exists, then it would be inappropriate for you to say, prove to me he doesn't, if someone asks you for proof that he does exist, because you would be shifting the burden of proof, because whoever makes a claim to truth must bear that burden to prove the very thing that they're claiming is true. So when he said that, I felt like my house of cards kind of collapsed. You know, I felt like, hadn't seen it from that perspective. So, what I really also just appreciated about being in that class is that I was allowed to ask questions, which was also something that was um, in church I'd get in trouble for doing. So, long story short, I learned a lot from that class, and I really started enjoying it. And then the next semester, I took another philosophy class, and everybody was telling me and warning me not to take this particular professor, because if I took his class, I might lose my faith, because he was an atheist that was very antagonistic and condescending towards Christians and towards religion and whatnot. And my attitude was really like, well, why should I avoid taking this guy's class? If anything, sign me up. You know, I want to hear what he has to say. I'm genuinely, curious to look for answers. You know, and especially now that I'm able to just ask questions and explore. So the pivotal moment for me in his class was one day when he walks into class. He pretends like he's holding up this antidepressant pill, and he says, "Now, religion wants us to believe in something like an immaterial soul, and because of this, we can have hope in an afterlife. We can have hope in seeing our relatives who have passed on before us." He said, "The problem is that if the soul exists, according to Christianity, it's not physical. But I'm holding this pill in my hand, and if I take this pill, then it has the power to affect and change the moods and states of my soul. Because according to Christianity, your moods, your emotions, and whatnot, these are also immaterial because they're in your soul. But if I take this antidepressant pill, then my mood and my emotions, it has the power to affect and change those. But how is it that something that is physical and tiny like a pill can affect something as immaterial like my soul?" He said, because every time you look at the brain, you see these neurons firing. Every time you look at the body, all you see are just physical chemicals interacting, but you never find anything like a soul. He said, how is that? He said, well, I'll tell you how that is. The answer is simple. The answer is that there is no soul, there is no heaven, there is no hell, there is no God, there is no afterlife. We're just a physical brain and body, and we need to learn to live with that fact and move on with our lives. You know, class dismissed, pretty much. So that was pretty pivotal for me, because I remember sitting there thinking, not only had I never met anyone that didn't believe in the soul, I never heard an objection or an argument raised against it. So It was a bit difficult for me because it was a point in my life where I pretty much thought, so here's something that if true would prove Christianity false, and I can either ignore it and just move on, or I can look into it and follow the evidence where it leads. And I'm not the kind of person to just ignore something. I'm the kind of person that's very curious. I want to explore. I want answers. I want to look into things. If someone were to tell me just have faith, I mean that kind of stuff doesn't work for me. And maybe we can get into later. What faith is in the first place, but that's not how faith works, right? So, anyways, and I'll go ahead and end it there. That's what really pushed me into to where I'm at today, leading me in the direction and path, and just looking, researching, and I'm happy to say I'm here. I am still today as a Christian, and in fact, the apologetics lead for the Baptist General Convention of Texas, and it's a blessing to do what I do.
Well, I mean, isn't it clear that like your faith was obviously shocked when you realized that the Bible was written by Bronze Age goat herders who didn't know where the sun went at night?
Yeah. Funny thing, and that's a common, I guess, soundbite that atheists like to use. And what's funny is it's they'll usually start to point at these passages or these interesting or unusual at face value verses that as a 21st century American society, when we read, we're not familiar with. But I don't know anybody that says I'm a Christian because I read, I'm just making this up, Leviticus chapter 8 verse 19. That verse right there, the historicity and certainty of knowing what this verse means, that made me a Christian. So it's as if atheists assume that having every single answer and idea from every verse of the Bible is what pushes someone to be a Christian. When in reality, some pre-suppers, they often give me heat for this, if you will. The reality is that even if we threw away one of the books of the Bible, which I'm not condoning by any means, but that wouldn't prove that Christianity is false or that God doesn't exist. So I think atheists like to attack these parts of the Bible because they think it's low-hanging fruit to just say, oh, how do you explain this? Oh, you don't know, haha, therefore Christianity is not true. It doesn't work that way.
All right. Well, that is nice. Well, a thing that you are known for is getting into the soul. That's sort of where you are your specialty is sort of into. I seen your recent conversation with Braxton Hunter, and I believe, but correct me if I'm wrong, that you had a debate with Matt Dillahunty on that subject.
Yeah.
And I think you had one with Tom Jump on it as well.
Yeah, we got into soul and consciousness with Tom Jump, yeah.
All right. So what got you into the topic, and what made you want to make it one of your focuses in your apologetics?
Well, yeah. So it's what I went into with my whole testimony on how I just got into apologetics in the first place. After having that class with that professor, it just kind of really became a central focus of mine because, as I said, that you were alluding to in my discussion with someone like Braxton and a video I just put out, another interview someone had done that's on my channel on the soul. If I would argue that if there's no soul, there can be no resurrection, because if you're just a body, then once the body's gone, you cease to exist. But in order for there to be a resurrection and for something to underline continuity of identity of who you are, and we can get into that later, there has to be something beyond the physical that grounds your identity, namely the soul. So if what my professor was saying is true, and there is no soul, then I would argue Christianity can't be true, because Paul said if there's no resurrection, then our faith is in vain. Christianity is false. Well, by the same token, I would argue if there's no soul, there's no resurrection. And if there's no resurrection, once again, Christianity is false. So that's what really kind of pushed me into that direction, to just kind of roll up my sleeves and start studying and looking into this subject. And that's when I, shortly after got a hold of the work of J.P. Moreland, who has become my favorite philosopher of all time. Love the stuff he does. He's influenced me so much on this topic, and this topic has influenced me so much that about a year ago I bought a Keo Soul, so I can make jokes about the soul and having a soul, not just being a soul, whenever I teach on this topic. And back in November, not too long ago, I actually had J.P. Moreland in my soul. So that was very, that was worth every penny of getting the car.
That's hilarious. Yeah, I think I remember you did that sort of. You told about that joke with Braxton Hunter.
Yeah, because I bought the car, I use that joke every chance I get.
Yeah. All right. Well, since we're on to the topic of the art of the soul, which is what I really wanted to get into, for the questions I got is these are supposed challenges to the notion that some arguments that proponents of the soul give, and that's what I wanted to just grill you on a bit to see how you can respond to it. All right. The private knowledge argument is, I believe, the argument that the physical properties can't be publicly known while mental properties are only privately known. Some have challenged that by denying epistemic first-person privilege, by saying we use induction to describe both our own behavior and other people's behaviors. How would you respond?
Yeah, so what the person there's trying to say essentially, and there's some technical terminology that some people might not be familiar with. So when we talk about one of the arguments I would use to demonstrate that consciousness is not physical, because when I argue for the soul, there's a two-part approach I take. The first is to demonstrate that consciousness is not physical, and the second point would be that I am more than my brain and body, and then based on those, we can conclude that therefore I am a soul. So those are that's the outline to how I argue the case for the soul. So what the question you're alluding to, sorry, hold on. The question you're alluding to there goes at the first point of consciousness not being physical. Now, when we talk about the first person introspective, one of the arguments one could give, and I have used it before, is that consciousness is a first person private access kind of thing, which means, take for example, my brain. My brain is something that can be third party accessible, meaning anything I can know about my brain is not privileged access for me. It's something that anybody with any kind of surgical tools could know just as much about my brain that I could. In other words, both you and I both have, in a sense, an equal access to looking into what my brain is and learning about my brain. So in other words, if a surgeon wanted to, they can pop open my skull. In fact, interestingly enough, a neuroscientist can know more about my brain than I do. By contrast, however, when it comes to my mental states, which I would argue are immaterial in my soul, not in my brain, only I have access to my mental states, which means only I know what I'm thinking. You can't know what I'm thinking, at least not directly, unless I reveal it to you in some sense. So a neuroscientist can know more about my brain than I do, but he could never know more about my thoughts than I do, because my thoughts are not in my brain, they're in my soul. Now,
Right.
to your question, is someone saying, well, no, basically we're just describing it differently. No, we're not. When I say I have a feeling of pain, and you say, no, it's just a C fiber firing. Well, C fibers firing, although there's a correlation with C fibers firing and a feeling of pain, it doesn't mean that they're necessarily the same thing. There's a correlation there, but as one atheist philosopher said, correlations are not explanations. They are, in fact, the very thing they need explaining. Strumming a certain way on a guitar while holding down certain strings may give me the note C, but it doesn't follow that guitar strings and strumming are the same thing as the note C. So the person there is trying to take a reductionistic approach, saying, no, we're just saying the same thing in different language. No, we're not. We are, in fact, describing two different things.
Well, I think because I was getting these from reading through some philosophy papers from some physicalists, and I think what they're trying to go for on this particular point is they're saying, well, we use induction on both ourselves and, per se, for other people. For example, like when I say I'm a good person, well, how would I really know that unless I could really say, well, in the past, I did a charity work, you know, and like with you, I could also say, well, how do I know Eric is a good person? Well, he does charity work, or he has a family that loves him, and he seems to be a good person. So we could say that we both use induction to know each other's behaviors. So I think what they're trying to say is that if you can sufficiently, like if you can ascribe, a mental state to yourself, or let's say an attribute to yourself through induction, you could do that reasonably with other people outside of you. I
I think
can't.
you're on mute.
Yeah, you're on mute.
Okay, sorry. What they're getting into, if I understand it correctly, is what's called the problem of other minds, and it sounds like they're basically saying, well, we can attribute consciousness to something else because there are similar behaviors that they do when I have those behaviors, and I would say yes and amen, but that is irrelevant as to whether or not consciousness is physical or material. Because to even know that there's no physical means that one could perform to know that one is conscious. Now someone can say, well, I can see that there's brain firings. Sure, but if I take a brain that's in a vat, nothing to do with any kind of a precept argument, but like if I literally took this brain that's in a jar, that's been, that some lab just keeps there for whatever reason, that's been there for 10 years, and I take it out of this jar and I start shocking it so that there are electrical signals happening in the brain, it doesn't mean that this brain is now conscious, right? So in other words, any way to know that a thing's mental states, in other words, to know what I'm thinking, you can't just look at my brain, you have to ask me. Now, while it's true that you can say, okay, well, I'm having this brain state X, and when I have brain state X, I'm thinking of, puppies. Well, I look at this person's brain and they're in brain state X. They must also be thinking about puppies. Now, this also gets into what's called, I forget the exact term, but basically it is an induction that the same brain state would produce the same mental state, but that's not necessarily the case, especially when you look at the fact that not everybody's brain's the same way. You have animal brains that are different, and it's conceivable to think of, to even say that if hypothetically speaking, I don't believe this, but hypothetically speaking, if there were an alien race that had, let's say, evolved differently, and their brains were made of something different than what our brains are made of, they could still experience a feeling of pain without having the brain states that we have. So I think there's a lot of assumptions behind what the person is trying to argue with that. Sure, that is how we would attribute that something else is conscious, that there are other minds, but it doesn't follow that therefore we know what mental states those people are in. And even if we did, it's only under the assumption that we know our mental states, and the only way we know our mental states is because our conscious states are not physical. Because, in other words, let's start here. When I ask you, how do you know you're in pain? You don't say, oh, I know I'm in pain because I walk around with this brain machine tied to my hip that I have to carry around with me. And when somebody, hits me with a needle, I look at this machine and it starts to calculate and it says, you are now in brain state Y. And I know brain state Y means I'm in pain. So when I see the computer say I'm in brain state Y, I think, oh, I must be in pain. Ouch. No, of course not, because that's not how consciousness works. So the very way that we know that consciousness, what it is by introspection, which is a first-person private access kind of thing, which is not accessible through some physical means.
All right.
What about the multiple personality objection? Like, you get brain damage and you become another person, and like there's this one example where they claim that this one guy had like 27 different personalities. Like which one's is his soul? Which one's gonna go to heaven? Which one's gonna hell? Is he gonna go to, like, where's he gonna go?
Yeah. So that there's in these kind of cases, which are unique, interesting cases, I think I've heard it called soul fragmentation, and excuse me. excuse me. What that basically means is these are a type of mental disorders, and there's something happening in the brain that's affecting the soul. I've argued before that you take a perfectly tuned guitar and I play a song, it's going to sound great if I know how to play the song. But if you start to clip my strings or you start to detune my guitar, it's going to affect the way my guitar is playing. Now, this doesn't mean that therefore there is no note C, or the note C is inside of the guitar, and if you break the guitar open, the note C is in there. It just means that there's a cause and effect relationship. Now, in these instances, in principle, the same thing's going on. Now, which one's going to go to heaven, so to speak, assuming that they hold different beliefs or whatnot. The interesting thing here is that what you have is these persons that are conscious.
No,
and
I think that the objection is that is the person himself going to go to heaven or hell if he has one soul and different personalities? Like one's a good person, one's totally evil.
Well, I mean, if I may defend Christians on this, I'm sure an all-knowing and all-loving God would be able to figure that out.
Yeah.
Like he would be able to know, like, well, what's his God, like, like, was this person genuine, and what information did he have?
Yeah, no, that is definitely a response one could use. That an all-knowing God would know in that situation, and that's why I even tell people, glad I'm the one, behind the judge's seat, right? I'm not in charge of that, and that's good. And the only person who could be would be an all-knowing God. And in addition to that, too, what I would get at is, and it would take a lot more to explain, but in a nutshell, so to speak, is that there are different states of awareness. And let me explain this before I get to the conclusion here. There are things I'm aware of, like a second order awareness, but then there's a first order awareness. In other words, I am aware of that we're talking right now, and I am aware that I'm talking to you guys right now. Now, contrast that with something that, let's say, in your peripheral vision. If I'm looking at the computer screen right now, in my peripheral vision, I can see the walls of the room. I can see, without looking, there's a ceiling fan above me. And while I have been aware of these things the entire time throughout this conversation, that was more of a second order awareness in the back of my mind. It wasn't a first order awareness in the forefront of my consciousness until I start talking about them and start looking at them and recognizing them. That being said, I think the same thing is happening with this multiple personality disorder, where the person themselves is aware in a second order sense of these multiple personalities, so to speak, but it's not as if he steps to the side and some other soul steps in. It's still him. He's just expressing himself in different types of ways. But there still is an overarching soul that is one soul, singular, working throughout these things. But to simplify it here, suppose today, you start talking to me and we're having a great conversation, we're cracking jokes, but then tomorrow you come over and we you start trying to pick back up on the joking, and all of a sudden I start cursing you out and I'm really upset, and you think, whoa, what's going on here? It's not that I have a multiple personality disorder, but it could be the fact that I had a great day yesterday and I'm having a bad day the second time you came around. Now, I say that simply to say it's not inconceivable for some person to have a different type of mindset or to seem like a different type of person. Now, I'm not saying that's the same thing. I'm saying in principle, you can see how a person can change almost drastically in different ways and characteristics. Now, group those characteristics into a certain type of person or in a certain type of body of expressions and label that another person or another personality, and you can do this multiple times. And in principle, I think something similar may be going on there. It's not something I've looked into too much because it doesn't necessarily have any kind of like, does it prove there is or is no soul? But it does get into interesting questions on how the soul interacts with the brain, and something like what I explained, I would say is going on and would be the case.
That's interesting. That's very interesting. I actually do think that is a bit more. I wasn't expecting that. Now, the second question, it's a bit longer. I got it partially from J. Warner Wallace, who had made an article, and I found it, another philosophy paper to go through and to see what would a response be that a physicalist would use. All right. The first person argument says that we only use first person possessive pronouns to indicate possessions. Like I say, I have a video game, and this is taken to mean that I'm describing something outside of myself and what I do with our bodies. Therefore, it refers to something outside of my body. Like I'm not the video game. That is, the video game is not my body. Um, all right. So, all right. I'm trying to think. Oh yeah. So, isn't it true though that Christians do the same thing with the soul when they say my soul is saved, as if they possess a soul like a video game, as in their soul is something other than them, and wouldn't that imply that these pronouns have other usages?
Yeah, I want to put too much stock into how a person casually uses language, um, because technically speaking, and when I teach on the soul, this is actually one of the points I address in my talk before anyone even asks questions. Is that technically speaking, we don't quote have souls. Technically speaking, I am a soul. So the word I is an indexical word that refers to something. So indexical words would be something like when I say the word here, I'm referencing a certain from a certain position, a certain location. When I say there, same principle. When I say the word I am referencing whatever I take myself to be as the thing that if I say I am thinking, then the word I is the conscious subject to which I'm referring to. So once when I teach on the soul, once we go through arguments that show consciousness is not physical. The second point is to show that I am more than my brain and body. And to do that is I say, okay, if consciousness is not physical, well, then the question, we know that these conscious states and properties exist, but we also know that these conscious states and properties are possessed by something, because properties, when they show up in the world, they don't just float around by themselves. In other words, the property of redness is not just floating around, in the freeway, and I don't get out my car and say, okay, I need to be sure that I don't hit the property of redness. Instead, I say I need to make sure I don't hit an object that possesses a property of redness. So we know that mental states and properties exist, and we ask ourselves, well, what possesses them? What is conscious? Well, I know for sure one thing is conscious, namely me. I am conscious. So the next question becomes, what am I? The word I, what is it referring to? Is it referring to a brain and body, or is it referring to something more than like a soul? I would argue it's referring to you, the soul. So when I say the word I am referring to me, the self, the subject, the soul. So technically speaking, I don't have a soul. I am a soul. What I have is a body. So I don't have a soul. I am a soul. I have a body. So I am a soul that has a body, and a body without a soul is just a dead corpse. And here is where my presentation.
Or a politician.
I'm sorry?
Or a politician.
so so here in my presentation is where I bring in the joke and I say, I don't have a soul, I am a soul. And then I say, well, actually, guys, I've recently changed my position on this, because about a year ago, I actually did come to find that I actually do have a soul, and it's a Kia Soul, and it's orange, and it's in my driveway. So I am a soul, and I do have a soul as well, and that's why I bought that car, so I can make that joke. So hopefully it gets laughs. And I know you guys buttons are muted, but it does help when I get a laugh, and that way it makes you feel like I made a good purchase. No, I'm joking. So I do have a soul in the sense, of course, of a car, but technically speaking, I am a soul. I don't say that I have a soul. And if I ever say, oh yeah, I have a soul, I'm loosely speaking, just for the sake of conveying some type of point in a casual conversation.
Oh, haven't you heard? All we are just that gelatinous mass in our heads called our brains and the spinal cord.
Yeah, and that's where we get into the second part of the whenever I talk about the soul is I am more than a brain and body, and that's where I go to show. So what would be helpful if we are going to get into the arguments, and I'm fine with that, or we can keep go into the questions because I'm sure the questions will touch on the arguments. But the important thing to understand is something called Leibniz's law of identity. And what this does is it gives us a good rule of thumb and a way of looking at two things in question and seeing if they're the same thing. So according to Leibniz's law of identity, if two things in question are the same, let's say if X is the same thing as Y, then whatever's true of X is going to be true of Y because they're the same thing. So in other words, take something like, for example, excuse me, water and H2O, right? There are two different names that we use to refer to the same thing. So we know they're the same substance, and we're just using two different references to talk about them. Now, that being said, say I walk into a lab and I see two bottles of clear fluid. One is labeled water, and let's say the other one, the label, it says chemical X, but let's say that the label is ripped off, so I can't see what it says. I want to know, are they the same substance? And I look and see that they're both clear fluids, and I say, well, so far they're the same substance. And then I turn over chemical X, and it says on the back, constant flammable. And I think to myself, okay, well, hold on. I know that water's not flammable, which means that even if I don't know what chemical X is, at the very least, I know that they're not the same thing. So, based on Leibniz's law of identity, if two things in question are the same, then they must share the same properties. However, if they don't share the same properties, then it follows that they cannot be the same thing. That being said, we use that same principle, that same law of identity, to know, okay, the word I, am I the same thing? Am I identical to, literally the same thing as, my brain and or body? Well, I think it's easy to show that we're not, and there's a number of arguments we can use for that. One simple one would be something like, let's say, the law of, identity through change. Am I the same person from one moment to the next? Just to throw it out there, let's say you cut off my arms and legs. If I'm still a person without my arms and legs, and it follows that having arms and legs isn't necessary for me to be the same person from one moment to the next. So, in other words, what part of me is necessary for me to be the same thing? That gets into the argument, but basically the argument is that while you can change every part of my body, if I remain the same person, then it follows that my identity through change is not dependent on or grounded in my physical brain and body. It must be something beyond my brain and body, namely the soul. So if I'm the same person from one moment to the next, here's the illustration I usually use. It's alleged every 7 to 10 years you change virtually every cell in your body. Suppose 7 to 10 years ago I commit a crime, I commit a murder, but they don't find the evidence till about 10 years later. Well, if the cops come knocking on my door and say, we just found the evidence to convict you, you're going to jail, it would make no sense for me to say, but officer, time out. That was 7 to 10 years ago. Go find that guy who committed the crime, because it wasn't me. Don't you know we're just our brain and bodies? And that was 7 to 10 years ago. Go find that guy, but good luck because he doesn't exist. Of course, they're just going to handcuff me and, take me to jail. So if I am the same person from one moment to the next throughout change and part replacement, then it follows that my identity through change cannot be grounded in my brain and body. It must be grounded in something more than that, namely the soul.
I was reading an atheist philosopher named Galen Strawson, and he brought up an interesting notion that there are people that legitimately can't see themselves in the past, they can't put them where they were. Even Galen Strawson says he's one of them. Where if you were to add, if you were to show him a picture of him last week, he'd say, that doesn't really feel like me there. There is some people that I can't remember, because he uses very technical language, of course, because philosophers do that. But I think he had he put into it on this video. I think it was called "What Are the Selves," and that's where he went more into it. I forget the atheist neuroscience or whatever that he was talking to with it. But anyway, getting into just atheist thinkers, who would you say is the best atheist thinker that you know of, and who has probably given you a challenge?
Are you talking about with regards to the soul?
The soul, or Christian apologetics in general.
I know Craig. Well, with regards to in the soul, excuse me. Jagwon Kim, who recently passed away, unfortunately, he had some really interesting stuff to say on the soul. I thought, and I haven't read a lot of his stuff, but definitely you've seen some of his stuff in articles and his views are really interesting. One of my favorite guys to listen to is John Searle, who's also an atheist philosopher, who is adamant about the fact that, look, a lot of these guys like Daniel Dennett have no idea what they're talking about when it comes to the mind. And this is an atheist philosopher, John Searle, talking about these other guys. Thomas Nagel, kind of same thing, wrote a book called Mind and Cosmos. Why I forget the long title. It's been a while. Why the neo-Darwinian, or why the Darwinian
Framework is almost certainly false.
Yes, there you go. So he also argues kind of similar that I'm arguing. You can't just get consciousness from nothing, from just rearranging matter. Now, with regards to apologetics in general, I think I know that Craig has said that Graham Oppy is crazy, scary smart, and the guy is very smart. But he's considered an agnostic, calls himself an agnostic, not necessarily an atheist. And I think he's had some really interesting views and really knows how to push back on some things.
Yeah, he's scary smart, scary smart.
Yeah.
Yeah, I seen that interview that he said that with. I believe Capturing Christianity is trying to get him and William Lane Craig into a conversation.
Yeah, that would be fantastic.
He debated Ed Phaser like 3 times.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. What do you make of the conclusions of guys like Sean Carroll and Michael Shermer when it comes to the soul, and people claim they debunked it or something?
Yeah. As you note, these were not the guys that I would put on the list as the really smart thinkers who pose any challenges, at least not in these areas of the consciousness and the soul. Shermer doesn't really have any arguments against it that I know of. He just questions everything and says, well, what if this? What if this? We don't know. Hey, look, this is kind of weird. So who really knows anything, right? Ha ha ha. Carol, basically, if you look at my talk with Braxton Hunter, excuse me, he allows me to kind of tackle a lot of what Carol's saying. But really, they're not even asking the right questions, I'd say. Now, Carol does get into something interesting in that if the soul did exist, this is how it would have to interact with the electrons or whatnot, or the matter, the particles, or something like that. I forget. I read it some time ago, but basically, he says if the soul would interact with the body, it would have to do X, Y, and Z. And I'm not a physicist, but I'm fine with that. Whatever, right? But then he starts to argue, so that means a soul must be something like A, B, and C, and he starts to basically get into describing something kind of physical. He's like, what kind of energy? What kind of this and that? And I'm like, well, you're already asking the wrong questions, because you're attributing physical attributes to something like a soul, which by definition is not physical. And you'd also have to assume something like what's called causal closure, that basically would have to say that every physical event is necessarily caused by some prior physical cause. But if that's the case, I would argue that first of all, I don't think causal closure is true, especially if God exists. So that kind of begs a question. And if causal closure is true, then we can never have free will. And if we don't have free will, you can't, take intellectual pride in what you believe, or intellectual integrity, because you were causally determined to believe that, and you can't take moral responsibility. You can't have moral responsibility for anything that you do. So it's a much longer explanation. In a nutshell, those would be the points I would go to begin to tackle those kind of objections.
Yeah, and Carroll's not in all fairness, he's a physicist, but he's not a neuroscientist.
Yeah, no, and I would say neuroscientists can lend some support to this, but I always like to remind people this is primarily a metaphysical question, not a physical question about neuroscience. And there are neuroscientists who believe in the soul.
And would you say that the soul activates the brain or what have you? Or is it more complicated than that?
No, I'd say that's about right. The soul uses a brain like an instrument.
Yeah.
Just like I would
Now,
use it.
yeah, I know that you went into before on the parts argument, but just to get more into that, wouldn't amnesia from a brain injury challenge the notion that someone's identity doesn't depend on their parts? There are some people who get brain damage that forget their past and assume a different name, life, and personality. Like, I know one woman, I believe, who she got a concussion and, like, in an alley, and then, like, she forgot her name, oh, the fact that she was married and had 2 children, and she became like a whole different person and got married to another man and had other children with that person until they eventually found him. So would you say at least our memory is partially responsible for our identity?
You're on mute.
Sorry. No, because let me ask you this question. Do you think that lady was the same person?
I would say, like, did she think she was the same person? Well,
No.
then,
Was she the same person? Irrelevant to what she thought.
I would say she was,
Okay. So then it
in the
follows
sense
that
that it was a
memory
time
is not
thing.
necessary.
Same human being who has assumed a different identity or a different way of thinking or different life.
Sure. Right. Yeah. So we could agree she's the same person, even though she didn't know she was. So um, having an epistemic justification or knowing that you're the same person is not a necessary condition for ontologically being the same person.
You would say it would be more sufficient, but not necessary.
Well, I wouldn't even say it's sufficient because even someone who may think they're a different person may not be the person. So I would say it's irrelevant as to whether or not it is in fact the case that someone is the same person. Now, it certainly helps epistemically to have those memories. It would help because it would, I guess, give a sense of assurance that I am the same person, but it's not necessary nor sufficient to grant that one is in fact the same person. Those are more questions of how do we personally justify that we are the same person, so to speak. But that gets into a different kind of a territory. But I would say to your question, no, it's not necessary to have these kind of memories to have identity to change.
All right. So this is sort of to take a break. These next 2 questions are more to take a break from it, and we'll go like on the number 7th one to get back into it. But for the question number 5, what is your strategy when discussing debates with people, like topics?
Yeah. Well, if I have some control over it, like I'm asked, what I would get into. It kind of depends on what positions the person takes, what position he holds to, and based on that is where I kind of would find, okay, what's a good topic to have with this kind of person, because I'm not, if there's an atheist who, let's say, believes in something completely different than I do, then let's touch that topic. But if I'm talking to an atheist who is, let's say, agnostic on other areas of things, then I wouldn't want to necessarily jump on those topics if he doesn't necessarily hold a position to it. If we're going to focus on something like, let's say, morality, it wouldn't make sense to talk about something that is irrelevant to that or in any kind of way. So what I like to do is first find a topic that is good for me and the other person, and then my tactic, if you will, is to look at the arguments they make, and to make my arguments in some way address their position as at the same time while expressing my position, and then seeing the tactics that they like to use, because a lot of times their tactics aren't even really good tactics, so to speak. It's just more like, oh, well, I don't believe what you're saying, and I'm like, don't care. Don't care if you don't believe what I'm saying. Obviously, you don't believe what I'm saying. Otherwise, we wouldn't be having a debate. Tell me why you don't believe what I'm saying. Don't just tell me you don't believe it and make this really funny face as if you're confused. I need more than that. That's not a response. So, really, put their feet to the fire, making them stick to the topic and address the things that I'm asking when it's relevant to the discussion.
And as another side topic, how do you feel being the guy who made Aaron Rod Nelson have an emotional breakdown during his debate with IP?
um, you know, I found that's not too hard to do. That's not the first time I met him. And I'm pretty sure he doesn't remember the first time I met him. And I'm fine with that. But I remember the first time that I met him, I actually tried to give him a compliment, like, "Hey, I think you did good on this debate that you did." Or I don't think I said you did good. I said, "Hey, I saw your this debate on this. Yeah, I think you made good points. I think you won that debate. So I was just kind of trying to give an olive branch, just to kind of introduce myself."
Yeah.
And then he's like, "Oh, thank you, something, 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 something." He goes, so what are you, Christian atheist?" I said, "Well, I'm an apologist." And then he just starts going off on me. I just met the guy, shake his hand, and then he just starts going off on me and complaining. And I'm just like, wow, this guy is volatile. This guy explodes quickly.
He's,
So
he's an apologist himself, just on the opposition.
right, yeah, no, absolutely. So I would say it's not too hard to I'm trying to be nice here. It's not too hard to trigger the guy, and I wasn't trying to. I really wasn't. I didn't expect him to blow up like that. I was hoping for a genuine answer, and you saw what I got. And for those who don't know what we're talking about, you can go on my channel and look at Atheist Yells at Eric Hernandez or something like that. You'll find that video.
Just remember, bring it.
Yeah, yeah. That's because it's funny because there's two things that have kind of become a thing from that, which I didn't expect, but I love is saying "bring it," which is something that he has
That's
said.
just the Rock saying, even though he looks like the Undertaker.
Yeah, yeah, and I had people tell me that, like, "Did you debate the Undertaker?" And then the other thing is him saying 20 years. So bring it, and like 20 years. I've been studying this thing for 20 years. Has kind of become a
Since 1999. Or 97 actually, but 20 years is more memorable.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Actually, in that debate, he looked just like Attila the Hun.
A what?
Attila the Hun.
Well, to be fair, we don't actually know what Attila the Hun looked like because it's not like could take
It looks
photos
like
or
what
he
we
had
would expect
portraits.
what we would expect him to look like.
Yeah,
Yeah,
you'll
I
have
mean,
to
we only
give me
have
a link to that.
descriptions. All right.
Also, Genghis Khan.
Yeah.
What's
So,
Attila the Hun?
Yeah, Genghis Khan.
I don't think I've heard of that.
yeah. Well, Genghis Khan's not really his real name. It's more of a title.
Yeah, Temujin.
Temujin was his real name, but it's sort of like if I called, let's say, Obama the president. Like, I see Obama and I just say, "Hey, president." It's a title, not really much of it's not the real name. It's just, we've associated the title so much with Temujin that it's pretty much synonymous with him. All right.
Anyway, next question.
Now, speaking of, since we got into Aaron Ra, who is more of an anti-theist, I see you've done a debate on actually anti-theism with Nick Scoter, I believe his name is, where I believe you wanted to show the pro-social benefits or how Christianity was actually good, and he, of course, wanted to say religion was bad. How do you think you did on that?
I think I did good.
I mean, he is a philosopher, but he's just beyond clueless when it comes to Christian history.
Yeah, I'm not sure what degrees he has, or if he is or not. I know he's philosophically minded, which I appreciate. And I really enjoyed that conversation that I had with him.
I think he's a middle school teacher. And I did feel sort of bad for him because I believe someone like a Christian family or something found out that he was an atheist and tried to bring that up with his boss.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So I can sort of,
Great guy.
like they were trying to get him in trouble because he was an atheist.
That's unfortunate.
Yeah.
But they allow it.
Why that would, I could get why some atheists can go through that and they can become very mad.
Then there's professors who are allowed to be antagonistic to religion like yours.
Yeah, right. Yeah,
Yeah,
usually in colleges that's more lenient and allowed.
yeah. So
Can't say I've had one like that. Professors, a couple of them were openly religious, and nobody complained.
yeah. So this is another question that I got a little. I took a little inspiration from J. Warner Wallace's article, where he gave like 6 reasons why the soul can't be the same thing, and this goes into the measurement sort of problem. Like, for example, it says we can measure, like I can take a ruler to your brain and say that your brain is, let's say, this many inches long, this many inches wide, etc. But we can't say I can't measure the emotion of anger with you, like, and say, oh well, your anger is 2 inches long. Uh, but isn't it true that we can measure physical things indirectly? What would someone say? Like, well, would say distinguish me estimating someone's height indirectly from an 8-foot tree in a photo and measuring, say, some supposed mental activity indirectly.
Yeah. So I don't think you can measure. So the argument, remember Leibniz's law of identity, and it would show that mental states do not possess physical states or properties. So a mental state of a thought can have the property of being true or false. No part of my brain, a neuron, is not true or false. A hemisphere of my brain is not true or false. So automatically they don't share the same properties. And all you need is one example to show, based on Leibniz's law of identity, excuse me, that these two things in question are not the same thing. Now, another illustration is to use, like what you're saying, is measurements. I can measure my brain being X inches long, but the taste of banana, which is in my mind, is not 7 inches long. So the argument is that in principle, you can't measure these things either directly or indirectly. It's like saying, well, I can look at a photograph and indirectly measure, guess a person's height, but you can't say, and I can also indirectly measure the number 8 and I can weigh it indirectly. No, in principle, these things don't have heights or mass or weight to them, because these are different categories that do not apply to these specific states. I'd say that's the same thing with mental states and properties. They don't fall into the category of having physical states or properties, so you can't think of them in the same way.
Mm-hmm. Now, we got a little bit on Aaron Raw beforehand, but I believe I heard you say that you were going to have a debate with him.
Yeah, I think
Didn't you already have a debate with him at one time?
Yeah, so interestingly, so that's a really fun, interesting one, is because after my video, he did see it and did comment on it.
Which explains the hordes of his jerk-off followers verbally attacking.
so, so he commented on it, and I remember basically I was like, yeah, you just repeated yourself, dude. Like, you haven't even, like, he didn't even touch the video, like anything I said in there. And then someone had basically, excuse me, it got enough attention to where like people were calling this guy out, and like I saw like a number of people shared that video with him, and he finally ended up to the point where he's like, okay, I'm gonna make he said he was gonna make a response video. He never, I can't remember if he even mentioned my name in that video, but I know he didn't reference my video, and I don't blame him, because I wouldn't want to point more people to that video if I were him either. But he didn't respond to what I said. In fact, I even commented on the video like, dude, you don't even respond to what I said. You're just repeating yourself. Like, it's not a response. So somebody reached out to me and said, would you want to have a discussion with him on my show? He initially said no. And I was like, okay, fine, whatever. It's not like I wasn't dying to talk to him or anything like that. And then when I commented on his video, he replied, and I said, look, I'll tell you what. I hear that someone is trying to wanting us to have a conversation. I'm down if you are. It wasn't until, from my perspective, as far as I can tell, I don't want to, say that I know this or I'm accusing of this, but just stating the facts here. It wasn't until it became a sort of public knowledge on his video in the comment section that I had said, I hear someone is trying to get us to talk. I'm down if you are. It wasn't until then that he's like, okay, let's do it. That was interesting. And so the first option didn't work out. So what we're going to do is just kind of have go on his show with some kind of a moderator. That didn't work out last minute. So I just ended up going on his show without a moderator, which would have had one, because if you go look at the video, which is also on my channel, I think he interrupted me over 200 times in like an hour and a half. It was pretty ridiculous.
You should get a moderator, because he never shuts the fuck up when he starts ranting.
Yeah, what's funny is I even told him, like, let me ask you a question and please just answer the question. I don't want you to go on another rant. And he's like, I don't go on rants. And I was like, okay. Okay, all right. So anyway, so that was interesting. You can go watch that. So this guy named his channel's named The Gospel Truth. He invited me to, if I would be willing to debate Aaron on the existence of the soul on his channel, and so I'm like, yeah, let's do it. And I know this guy would step in and moderate, so I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, are you going to bring it?
I definitely am going to bring it. I'm going to bring it. Now, I can't say I've had 20 years of research on this, unfortunately, but I will be bringing it.
Better than, he doesn't really do any research on anything outside of biology and geology and related topics on that, but he has this amazing talent for getting like everything. I mean, not virtually or almost. I mean, literally everything wrong when it comes to religion, philosophy, and theology.
Yeah, he's definitely not, and he'll admit this himself. He's not much of a philosophy guy, and yet most of the stuff he talks about, 95% of the time in his debates, is philosophy. So yeah,
He doesn't know anything about it.
Right. Yeah.
Then there's a book you should read by a few agnostics and atheists. They did a collaboration on this with Inspiring Philosophy. It was The Foundational Falsehoods of Aaron Ra.
Yeah, I heard about that. Yeah.
It was pretty good. It was I actually got the book myself. It was pretty interesting read. Very academic.
Like, if you read this and you still take him seriously, you're just out of touch.
Yeah.
Yeah, apparently I don't know if he's going to do a response to that or not. I haven't looked into it or anything like that, but I mean, I'm glad there are people, even non-Christians, who are coming out and saying, yeah, I mean, even after I made that video on him, again, that you can look on my channel to find, I even had some people contact me or say, I used to listen to Aaron, or, I showed this video to a friend of mine who's an atheist who listens to Aaron, and, they're starting to realize that this guy really doesn't know what he's talking about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
They just, a lot of impressionable people cling on to him because he has that cocksure assurance. Like, he thinks he knows what he's talking about, even though he doesn't.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, there's something about being so confident and so adamant and so even condescending to somebody else that you're making them look bad or dumb, that gives you this sense of, oh, this guy must be an authority figure. And I think
you have to remember, he's a politician.
And it's mostly because he's been slapping down low-hanging evangelical fruit for 20 years.
Yeah. No, he does seem to kind of, every time you hear him talk, he's like, believers have told me this, believers have told me this. And I'm like, what believers are you talking to? Who are you talking to that has these kind of views? And yeah, he often goes for that low-hanging fruit, so to speak. In other words, he like attacks the simplest. I've never heard him give an explanation and a play-by-play explanation or rebuttal to something like the ontological argument. I'm not surprised either. But that's kind of the thing. He doesn't go for those high things.
And then he'll repeat historical myths about Christianity, even though he's been corrected on this, like in 2000, like exactly 20 years ago. He's been corrected on people thinking the world was flat during medieval times, and here he is 20 years later just repeating that.
Yeah, a lot of fallacies like that, like a genetic fallacy or anything like that, or ad hominems. He used, whether intentional or not, I don't know, but yeah, he does repeat a lot of that kind of stuff.
Yeah. So this last question is, this is the last little criticism that I've noticed physicalists have given against the soul. This one comes from Jeffrey Lauder, I believe. He had a debate with Frank Turek. Uh, so often, when soul critics hear from an apologist about only mental things being about something, they point out there are plenty of physical things that are about something, like a photograph or a painting. How would you respond to that?
Yeah, so intentionality is something that's internal, not imposed externally. So so a photograph is not about anything. So when I talk about aboutness, for example, when I say, suppose I have the feeling of hunger or a desire for food, excuse me, hold on. Excuse me. Suppose I have a desire for food. Well, my desire and thoughts and beliefs are about eating or about food. And there are certain mental state, but there's nothing physical that is about hunger or food. In other words, when I'm hungry, my neurons that are firing, my neurons aren't hungry. I'm hungry. If my neurons were hungry, then how could you say I'm hungry if it's my neurons that are hungry? I'm hungry, not my neurons. When I get sleepy, my neurons aren't sleepy. And then you say, well, isn't a photograph about something? Because when you talk about intentionality, it's of or aboutness. No, a photograph is not about anything any more than when I look at a menu. When I look at a menu and I look at the ink that's on the paper, and I can look at the chemical composition of the ink and the chemical composition of the paper and the way it bonded to the paper, those are not about anything. Information is when if we were to say, oh, this book is about X, Y, and Z, we're using that in a loose sense, not in a philosophical sense. So a menu is not about anything. If anything, all you have are squiggly lines on a piece of paper, but the information is imposed onto it externally by the way we have constructed language and grammar and sentence and structure. But a piece of paper with ink on it is not about anything. What we do is we interpret the symbols that are on there based on the information we have externally imposed onto it from our perspective based on the rules of grammar and whatnot.
That is pretty fair.
Okay, and then there's the what you were talking about in your talk with that one guy, what's his face? You were talking about yeah, everything's predetermined. Like there's atheists that think everything's predetermined and we have no free will, and why are they self-congratulating about their atheism if they have no control over the matter, and why do they demean religious people when they have no choice in the matter?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, certainly. And without free will, you like I was saying earlier, like you're alluding to, you can't take intellectual integrity or credibility for what you believe if everything was determined. And if there's no free will, then a person's decision to become an atheist is no more rational than a religious nuts person's decision to write on a sign and hold it up, in the street corner and start yelling at people as they drive by.
Yeah, that is actually pretty interesting. Let me see. All right. Yeah, so that was that was the final question. And we're at an hour, so that's how long we typically go here. Do you got any questions that you would like to ask Eric yourself, Carlos?
Who's Carlos?
Don't make me take a plane to your house and shove my foot up your ass.
What'd you ask, Carlos?
No, I go by many names on the internet.
Oh.
Yeah. Yeah, he's been doing that whole stick to me for a while. Yeah.
Anyway, that's about it.
All right.
So what positions do you guys hold to?
Huh?
Are there any particular positions you guys hold to on these questions?
What do you say?
Are there any particular positions that you guys hold to on these questions?
Yeah, I believe we have a soul. It just doesn't make any sense that all that defines us is that gelatinous mass in our head and the spinal cord.
Yeah.
Eh,
I think
I
of
will
the
say I'm not firmly grounded on any position right now. I am actually planning on doing a video in the future, going more into this, but I would have to do more reading and make sure I get my position straight before I can make any claims.
then
Yeah.
the,
Are you a believer, Christian?
Yeah, oh yeah, I'm a deist.
Gotcha.
I tend to think of the soul as the lamppost and the soul as the torch that lights it up.
Well, I mean, what I've always found funny about that philosophy, that professor you were talking about, this whole notion, of, I take this pill and it makes me feel better, or something, and therefore I don't have a soul. They're presupposing there's only one version of dualism out there.
And there's atheists that
That's Cartesian dualism.
Yeah.
And there's atheists that act like nobody's ever thought about this stuff before. Like the ancient Egyptians knew about brain damage and stuff like that, but they still knew there was a soul and their entire system revolved around the afterlife.
Well, I mean, granted, it's not like no one's claiming that they were modern neuroscientists there, but it's like they understood that if you whacked a guy over the head hard enough with a club, he wouldn't be the same person, or he'd be slightly different than he was prior to being hit with the club. They weren't that stupid.
Right. They knew that there was a correlation between the brain and the mind. And I think, the point that he was getting at there was that, which I'm sure you'd agree with, is that it's not as if, oh, look, we know more about the brain, therefore, oh, there must not be a soul. No, they weren't, like you said, they weren't that dumb to think, oh, there must not be a soul because, when you hit people, it's not as if they thought you hit people over the head really hard, nothing happens. No, they knew that there was a correlation.
Well, granted, they thought that the changed behavior was due to demonic possession or something. So no one's claiming that they were like modern neuroscientists on the data, but it can't be denied that it's not like they had no idea what was going on.
Right.
Are you also aware of Jeffrey Long and his research on near-death experiences?
No, I don't think so.
J.P. Moreland actually does go greatly into that. He actually made a response. I actually read J.P. Moreland's response to Graham Opie, because Graham Opie had written a paper, giving a response to the argument from consciousness for God's existence.
Yeah, I remember. Yeah, I remember. I'm hearing Moreland's response there, and I know Gary Habermas and Moreland have touched a lot on near-death experience, and it's really fascinating.
Mm-hmm. I think it is something interesting that people do have to take into consideration.
Oh yeah, and also wanted to touch on you acknowledge that animals and all living things have a soul.
Yeah, I'd say anything conscious would need a soul, because if the mind is not physical, then it would need to be grounded in some substance that is also not physical, namely the soul. So if something's conscious, then I would say, yeah, it would have a soul.
Would you say a dog or something would be capable of suffering, like not just having pain but suffering? I like to distinguish pain from suffering, because there is a tendency to conflate the two, but they're not necessarily the same thing.
Sure, yeah, and there are different levels of suffering. I definitely agree with you there.
For example, there are some people that they get pleasure out of inflicting pain on themselves. We would agree that they're feeling pain, but they're not suffering because they like it.
Then there's other objections with Alzheimer's and people in comas. What's your response to that?
Yeah, it would be the same thing as I mentioned a little earlier about the guitar illustration. If you were to mess up my guitar, break it, doesn't mean that the music disappears. It just means that the instrument or my talent disappears. It just means the instrument by which I use to convey the music and talent that I have is no longer being able to be translated or applicable to the situation because you messed up my instrument. I say the same thing happens with Alzheimer's or brain damage and things like that. If you affect the instrument I'm using, you're going to affect the way I play the music. Same thing with the soul and brain.
And certain parts of your brain get destroyed, and those functions no longer exist unless you die altogether, and then you reanimate in heaven or any sort of afterlife.
Yeah, and the thing is that if you could somehow restore those things, you would still you'd be able to do whatever it was you did again, because your soul is what grounds your capacities. It just needs a physical instrument while in the body to express and convey those capacities.
I'm sure
there has been some Christians that have proposed the idea of soul sleep.
Sure.
Where basically once we die, we're sort of unconscious until the resurrection when God just raises our bodies. I can't remember. I know that there was some Christian philosophers recently that took that position. Pretty popular. I can't remember his name for the life of me. He used to be, I think it's Alistair McGrath or something like that. I think he takes more of the soul sleep view. I'm not sure.
And I'm sure this might be your favorite objection or question, but what is the soul made of?
It's not. I would say it's not composed of anything. It's something metaphysical. It's kind of like asking what is the number 2 made of. It's not made of anything because the notion of made of is a physical notion. Just like you can't say, what does a number 3 taste like? These are category fallacies that don't apply to the thing in question.
It tastes like cherry.
I think the color blue tastes like cotton candy.
Or like when people say, hey, get me a Gatorade. Which one what flavor? Give me the green flavor.
Yeah, that's funny. Yeah, or I remember when some people get high on drugs, they say, "Dude, I can taste the color blue."
Yeah, those require certain types of drugs to do that.
Yeah. But anyway, we've actually gone a little farther than we usually do. We usually go and stop around an hour. Do you have any last remarks you would like to get into?
Appreciate you guys having me on, of course. And anybody wants to learn more, know more, you can go to my channel. You can just type in Eric Hernandez in the YouTube search, or just put youtube.com/c/Eric Hernandez, and you'll find my channel there.
And where can people find you in general, or what future projects are you working on?
They have a excuse me. I have a website. I don't keep up with the website too much, but it has some stuff I've articles I've written in the past. EricHernandezMinistries.com. But I usually try and stay active on Facebook, at least with the ministry page. You can just Eric Hernandez Ministries or Eric Hernandez TXB Ministries. So I work for Texas Baptist. You can find that on Facebook. Twitter is EHM_apologetics, and they can just look me up on there.
All right. Well, it was fun having you on. We had to have some interesting conversations on this. Yeah. So, yeah, we're gonna go.
Like, share, subscribe, and go subscribe to Speedy Hernandez, the Soul Man.
Yeah, for everything else, thank you.
All right, see you next time.
All right, thank you guys. Appreciate it.
Yeah.